Deltora Shadowlands, the Cavern of the Fear. Chapter 8, Discoveries. It was the deepest part of night when Leif and Doom returned to Dell with Marilyn. Like thieves, the three slipped into the silent palace by the kitchen door. Sharn was sitting at the table waiting for them. She jumped up, her face wreathed in relieved smiles. "You're really here," she cried. "When your message came that you would be back so soon, I could hardly believe it." She hastened to settle Marilyn by the stove with a mug of hot soup. Then she drew Leif aside. "I have much to tell you," she whispered. "There is wonderful news, but bad news as well." Doom's voice interrupted them. "I'm going to wake Glock," he called from the door. "We should talk to him at once." "Why Glock?" Sharn demanded. "What has he to do with—" "I will tell you later, Mother," Leif said in a low voice as Doom left the room. "Give me your news. The bad news first, while we cannot be overheard." He nodded towards Marilyn, who was leaning towards the stove, warming her chilled hands. The girl looked delicate, defenseless, and very tired. If she was frightened on her first night at the palace, she might beg to return to Tora. Such a request could not be denied, so it was vital that it was never made. Guards reporting for duty on the third floor this afternoon found that the two men they were to replace were asleep and would not wake, Sharn whispered. "We believe they were given a powerful sleeping potion in some ale." Leif felt the chill that always came over him when he thought of the third floor. "The sealed room?" he whispered. "Had the wall been—" Sharn nodded reluctantly, seeing lines of worry deepen on her son's face. The mortar between the bricks had crumbled away, and some of the bricks had fallen. But the hole was small, and the door beyond was shut fast. Perhaps the intruder was disturbed before he could enter. "We must just hope that is so," Leif muttered. "Has the damage been repaired?" "Of course," his mother answered. She glanced at the drooping figure of the girl in the armchair. "Poor child, what a place he has come to. And she's so young." Leif smiled ruefully. "No younger than me," he reminded her. "Or Jasmine." "Oh," Sharn exclaimed. "That reminds me, the good news. The Deltora Annals had been finally returned to us. And it was Jasmine who brought it about." She had expected her son to be pleased, but even she was startled at the sudden, disbelieving joy that lit his face. Before she could ask him to explain it, however, Doom strode back into the kitchen, his face like thunder. "Glock is not in his bed," he muttered. "No doubt he is snoring under a table in some tavern in the city." "Let him snore," Leif grinned. "We do not need him any longer." Soon after, Leif and Doom were being excitedly welcomed by Joseph, his white hair ruffled, the folds of his borrowed night robe flapping about his thin legs. He seized one of the books lying on the table. "I had no idea your Majesty would be back so soon," he cried, flipping pages rapidly. "There is something I must show you, something of great importance." "I would like to see everything in its turn, Joseph," Leif said hastily, "but just now I have some research of my own that—" He heard a slight sound behind him, and turned to meet the shrewd hazel eyes of a dark man with a humorous twist to his mouth. This, Leif knew, must be Ranesh, Joseph's apprentice. How silently he had approached. Unlike Joseph, he had taken the time to dress before leaving his room at the back of the library. Perhaps that said something about the difference in their characters. Ranesh was the man who would not rush to anyone's bidding. He was a man who would weigh his decisions carefully, a man whose real character it would be difficult to know. A man like Doom, thought Leif, glancing at his friend. Doom was watching the newcomer. Leif knew that he was trying to decide if Ranesh was to be trusted. "We should have tidied this table before going to our beds, I know," Joseph was chattering, still searching his book. "But I wish to clean the shelves before arranging the annals. I fear the library has been sadly neglected. Then I became very tired and—" "Of course," Leif said, in a frenzy to have time alone with the precious books. I'm sorry that our arrival woke you, Joseph, and you too, Ranesh. Please return to your rest. We are quite able to—" "Ah, here it is," Joseph cried. He placed the open book on the table and pulled out a chair. "Read, Your Majesty," he begged. "And here," he pushed forward paper and pencil. "You can take notes with these if you wish, as young Jasmine did this afternoon." "Jasmine?" Leaf exclaimed. "She was reading?" "Oh, yes," Joseph nodded. "She was taking notes from the Annals." "From Volume 1, Ranesh put in. "I happened to notice before she closed it." "Ah, yes, you would notice, Ranesh," thought Leaf. "There is not much those sharp eyes miss, I fancy." He glanced at Doom's expressionless face, knowing that Doom was wondering, as he was, whether Jasmine had somehow also heard of the Pirran Pipe. "Now, Your Majesty," urged Joseph, waving at the open book. "Will you read?" "Certainly I will, Joseph, but only if you and Ranesh leave us," said Leaf, trying with all his might to keep his voice casual and unhurried. "I will not be able to concentrate if I know I'm keeping you awake." Joseph hesitated, his eyes flicking from the open book to Leaf's face and back again. "We will speak again soon," Leaf added, forcing a smile. At last Joseph nodded, tugging at Ranesh's sleeve to make sure his assistants followed his lead. He bowed and shuffled away. Soon Leaf and Doom heard the sound of their murmured good nights and doors closing at the back of the library. "At last," Leaf breathed. "Now to find this tale." He swung round to the table. The book lay open at the place the old librarian had been so anxious for him to see. Leaf glanced impatiently at the yellowed pages, the small, exquisitely neat printing. A name caught his eye. He gasped and stared. "Doom," he whispered, "look." The tale of the Pirran Pipe. Long, long ago, beyond the mountains, there was a green land called Pirra, where the breezes breathed magic. Jealous shadows lurked on Pirra's borders, but the land was protected by a mysterious pipe, which played notes of such beauty that no evil could take root within sounds of its voice. The pipe was played morning, noon, and evening by the people's chief, the piper, who was the finest player in the land. One dark winter's night, the piper of those days passed away in her sleep. The next day, 3 great musicians offered themselves as a replacement. They were called Plume the Brave, Oran the Fair, and Keras the Unknown. The 3 played in turn before the people, as was the custom. Plume's playing was so stirring that the crowd cheered. Oran's music was so beautiful that her audience wept. Keras created sounds so haunting that all who heard them were wrapped in wonder. When the people voted to choose their favorite, each player received an equal number of votes. The 3 played again and again, but each time the result was the same. Night fell, but the testing went on. The people, who had by now separated into 3 groups according to their favorite, grew tired and angry, but each person wanted his or her own choice to become the piper, and would not vote for another. At last, long after midnight, when the vote was called equal for the 13th time, the 3 groups turned furiously upon one another, using their magic to insult and injure. A man in a hooded cloak stepped forward. He was tall, but bent with weakness, as though the long day and night of music had been almost beyond his endurance. Each section of the crowd thought that he was one of its own, for he had spent time with all 3, urging its members to hold firm. "I have a solution, my friends," he cried. "Let the contestants share the honor of being piper. The pipe is made from 3 parts which fit together. Let Plume, Oran, and Keras each take 1 part of the whole." And so tired, so angry had the people become that they agreed. They gave Plume the mouthpiece of the pipe, Oran the middle stem, and Keras the end piece. Then, because they still had bad feelings for one another, the 3 groups went their separate ways, each group following its own favorite. The hooded man rubbed his hand, well satisfied, and slipped away like a shadow before the rising of the sun. The dawn broke with no sound of music, and the long day passed in silence, for the three rival groups were far apart, and no one piece of the Pirran Pipe could be played alone. Shadows crept into Pirra. Trees withered in their shade, and flowers wilted. Little by little, the shadows swallowed up the green fields, the pleasant villages, while every moment the dread power cloaked within them grew stronger. Too late, the three groups realized their danger. Shadows now rolled dark between them. They could not reach one another to make the magic pipe whole, and at last, seeing that their land was lost, they were forced to use the last of their magic to escape and save themselves. So it was that the green land of Pirra became the Shadowlands. Its people, still blaming one another for their ancient loss, dwell to this day on 3 separate islands in a strange and secret sea. And the Pirran Pipe, forever divided, is heard no more.